The sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the ruined landscape as Mr. Floss surveyed the scene before him. He was a tall, wiry man with a face weathered by the harsh realities of the post-apocalyptic world. His eyes, sharp and calculating, scanned the wreckage of the battleship that lay strewn across the rocky shore. Floss was a legend among the salvage crews, known for his uncanny ability to find valuable resources in even the most unlikely places. In a world where survival depended on scavenging the remnants of the old world, his skills were in high demand. He had handpicked his team for this mission, a group of experienced and trustworthy individuals who shared his determination to succeed. There was Jax, a burly man with a scar running down his left cheek, a memento from a close encounter with a bot during a previous salvage run. Beside him stood Nyx, a lithe woman with a keen eye for spotting valuable components. Rounding out the team were the twins, Arlo and Zeke, who had a reputation for being able to dismantle any machine with lightning speed. As they approached the rusting hulk of the battleship, Floss could feel the familiar rush of adrenaline coursing through his veins. The ship had been a relic of the Great War, a floating fortress that had once been a symbol of humanity's power. Now it was little more than a decaying tomb, its metal skin slowly being reclaimed by the elements. But Floss knew that within the ship's crumbling interior lay a wealth of resources that could mean the difference between life and death for the settlements that clung to survival in this harsh new world. Computer components, weapons, and even scrap metal could be repurposed and traded for the essentials of life. The team made their way cautiously across the rocky shore, their boots crunching on the debris that littered the ground. As they drew closer to the ship, the enormity of the task before them became apparent. The once mighty vessel lay on its side, its hull torn open by the force of the waves that had driven it aground. Jagged metal edges jutted out at odd angles, creating a treacherous maze that they would have to navigate to reach the ship's interior. Floss signaled for the team to halt, his hand raised in a clenched fist. He surveyed the wreckage, his eyes narrowing as he searched for the best point of entry. After a moment, he gestured towards a gaping hole in the ship's side, large enough for them to pass through. There, he said, his voice low and gravelly, "We'll enter through that breach. Stay alert and watch your step. There's no telling what we might find inside." The team nodded, their faces grim with determination. They knew the risks of venturing into the unknown, but they also knew the rewards that awaited them if they succeeded. As they approached the breach, the smell of salt water and rusting metal grew stronger, mingling with the acrid tang of decay. Floss led the way, his flashlight cutting through the gloom as he stepped into the ship's interior. The sight that greeted them was one of utter devastation. The once orderly corridors were now a twisted maze of debris, with shattered bulkheads and tangled wires blocking their path at every turn. The only sound was the distant creaking of metal, echoing through the cavernous space like the groans of a dying beast. Floss motioned for the team to spread out, each taking a different section of the ship to search for salvageable materials. They moved slowly, their flashlights sweeping over the wreckage as they picked their way through the debris. As they worked, the sense of unease that had been growing in the pit of Floss's stomach began to intensify. There was something about the ship that felt wrong, a presence that seemed to lurk just beyond the edge of his vision. He shook his head, trying to dismiss the feeling as nothing more than nerves. But then, without warning, all hell broke loose. A flurry of movement erupted from the shadows, as a swarm of rusting robotic figures burst forth from the darkness. Their metal bodies were pitted and corroded, but their eyes glowed with a malevolent red light. Floss yelled out a warning, his hand already reaching for the plasma rifle slung across his back. The team reacted instantly, dropping their salvage and reaching for their own weapons as the robots closed in. In that moment, as the sounds of battle filled the ruined ship, Floss knew that they were in for the fight of their lives. The machines had been waiting for them, lurking in the shadows like predators stalking their prey. As he lined up his first shot, Floss could only hope that his team's skills and determination would be enough to see them through. In a world where every day was a struggle for survival, they had no choice but to fight with everything they had. The battle for the rusted grave had begun. The sound of gunfire echoed through the ruined corridors of the battleship as Floss and his team fought for their lives. The robots had taken them by surprise, emerging from the shadows with a relentless fury that seemed to defy their rusted and deteriorating frames. Floss ducked behind a shattered bulkhead, his plasma rifle clutched tightly in his hands. He could hear the whine of energy weapons and the clatter of metal on metal as his team engaged the machines. The air was thick with the acrid smell of ozone and burning circuitry, a testament to the ferocity of the battle. Beside him, Jax let out a grunt of pain as a searing bolt of energy grazed his arm. The big man gritted his teeth and kept firing, his face a mask of grim determination. Across the corridor, Nix and the twins had taken up positions behind a pile of debris, their weapons spitting fire into the advancing horde of robots. Floss knew that they were outnumbered and outgunned, but he also knew that they had no choice but to fight. To surrender would be to condemn themselves to a fate worse than death, to be torn apart by the merciless hands of the machines. With a roar of defiance, Floss leapt from his cover and charged towards the nearest robot. He brought his rifle up and fired point blank into the machine's chest, the plasma bolt tearing through its rusted armor and sending it staggering backwards. But even as the robot fell, two more took its place, their metal claws reaching out to grasp at Floss's flesh. He spun and dodged, his movements a blur of desperate speed as he fought to stay alive. Around him, the battle raged on, the air filled with the screams of the wounded and the dying. Floss saw Arlo go down, his chest pierced by a jagged shard of metal that had been thrown by one of the robots. Zeke let out a howl of anguish and threw himself at the machine that had killed his brother, his fists pounding against its metal hide. Floss knew that they couldn't hold out much longer. The robots were too many, too relentless. He could feel the weight of despair settling over him like a suffocating blanket, the realization that they might not make it out of this alive. But then, just when all seemed lost, a miracle happened. A stray plasma bolt, fired by Nix, struck one of the robots in the head, sending it toppling to the ground in a shower of sparks. The other machines hesitated, their programming struggling to adapt to this unexpected development. Floss seized the moment, rallying his team with a shout of encouragement. They surged forward, their weapons blazing as they pressed their advantage. The robots fell back, their movements becoming erratic and uncoordinated as the salvage team pushed them back. In the end, it was over almost as quickly as it had begun. The last of the robots fell, its metal body shattered and lifeless on the deck. Floss and his team stood panting and bleeding, their faces streaked with sweat and grime. But even in the midst of their victory, there was no joy to be found. Arlo lay dead, his body still and silent in the wreckage. Jax and Nix were both wounded, their blood mingling with the oil and hydraulic fluid that pooled on the deck. Floss felt a wave of grief and anger wash over him, a bitter acknowledgement of the price they had paid for their survival. He knelt beside Arlo's body, his hand reaching out to close the dead man's eyes. "We'll bury him on the shore," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "He died fighting, like a true warrior." The others nodded, their faces etched with the same sorrow and determination. They gathered up Arlo's body and carried him out of the ship, picking their way carefully through the debris. As they emerged into the fading light of day, Floss took a deep breath, the salt air stinging his lungs. He knew that they had won a victory, but at a terrible cost. The robots were still out there, lurking in the shadows and waiting for their next chance to strike. But for now, they had a duty to perform. They would bury their dead, salvage what they could from the robots they had destroyed, and then make their way back to the settlement. There was still work to be done, still a war to be fought. As he watched his team prepare for the journey home, Floss felt a grim sense of purpose settle over him. They had survived this battle, but the war was far from over, and he would be ready, no matter what the future might bring. The sun was setting by the time they finished burying Arlo. They had chosen a spot on the shore, overlooking the vast expanse of the ocean. It seemed fitting, somehow, to lay him to rest in a place of such wild beauty, untouched by the ravages of the war. Floss stood at the head of the grave, his head bowed in silent tribute. Around him, the others did the same, their faces etched with grief and exhaustion. They had all known the risks when they had signed on for this mission, but that didn't make the loss any easier to bear. As the last rays of sunlight faded from the sky, Floss cleared his throat and spoke, his voice rough with emotion. Arlo was a true friend and a brave warrior, he said. He lived and died by the code of the salvage crew, never backing down from a fight. We will honor his memory by continuing the struggle, by never giving up in the face of the machines. The others murmured their agreement, their voices low and somber. They knew that Arlo's sacrifice would not be forgotten, that his name would be added to the list of heroes who had given their lives in the fight against the robots. With heavy hearts, they turned their attention to the task of salvaging what they could from the remains of the robots they had destroyed. It was grim work, picking through the shattered metal and twisted circuitry, but they knew that every component they recovered could be put to use in the ongoing war effort. Nix and Jax took the lead, their nimble fingers prying loose the most valuable parts. The twins, Zeke and the now-deceased Arlo, had always been the best at this kind of work, but now Zeke worked alone, his face a mask of stoic determination. As they worked, Floss kept a watchful eye on their surroundings, his plasma rifle never far from his hand. He knew that the robots could strike at any moment, that they could be watching even now from the shadows. But the attack never came. Perhaps the machines had been more badly damaged than they had realized, or perhaps they had simply moved on to other targets. Whatever the reason, Floss was grateful for the respite, however temporary it might be. By the time they had finished their salvage work, the night was well advanced. They knew that they couldn't risk staying out in the open any longer, that they needed to begin the long trek back to the settlement. They gathered up their gear and their hard-won salvage, distributing the load evenly among them. Floss took one last look at Arlo's grave, silently promising to return one day and pay his respects properly. Then, with a nod to the others, he set off into the darkness, his boots crunching on the rocky ground. The journey back to the settlement would be a long and dangerous one, through territory that was all too often prowled by roving bands of robots. But Floss was determined to see it through, to bring his team back alive, and to deliver the precious cargo they had risked so much to obtain. He knew that every component they had salvaged could mean the difference between life and death for the people of the settlement, that their mission had been a vital one. As they walked, the sound of the ocean faded behind them, replaced by the eerie silence of the wasteland. The only light came from the stars overhead, cold and distant in the night sky. Floss felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders, the knowledge that he was responsible for the lives of his team. He knew that he would stop at nothing to keep them safe, to bring them back to the settlement in one piece. And so they pressed on, through the long hours of the night, each lost in their own thoughts and memories. They were a band of survivors, forged in the crucible of the war against the machines, united by a common purpose and a shared history of loss and sacrifice. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, they saw the familiar outlines of the settlement in the distance. They were home, battered and bruised but alive, their mission accomplished. Floss felt a sense of grim satisfaction as they made their way through the gates, greeted by the cheers and tears of their fellow survivors. They had struck a blow against the machines, had brought back vital resources that could help turn the tide of the war. But even as they celebrated their victory, Floss knew that the fight was far from over. The robots were still out there, still a threat to everything they held dear, and he knew that he would be ready to face them again, no matter the cost. For in this world, there could be no peace, no rest, until the last of the machines had been destroyed, and Floss would be there, leading the charge, until the very end. Thank you for listening to this story. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please be sure to subscribe and leave a like. I'll see you in our next video.